For 5 years, she was the shadow behind the throne, the unmarked mate who bled, fought, and sacrificed everything for the Alpha King. But when the High Council demanded a pure-blood queen to secure the realm's borders, Genevieve did what she had always done. She silenced her own heart. She packed her meager belongings, stepped aside, and stood in the chilling rain to watch the man she loved bind his soul to another. It was supposed to be the end of her story, a quiet fade into exile. She never expected the Alpha King to bare his fangs at the altar, shatter the ancient rites, and risk a brutal civil war, all because his wolf recognized a devastating truth everyone else had missed. The stone walls of Ethelgard Castle were always cold in the autumn, but tonight the chill seemed to seep directly into Genevieve's bones. Standing in the center of the dimly lit bedchamber she had shared with Alpha King Tristan for the better part of 5 years, she meticulously folded a heavy wool tunic. It was a simple, repetitive task, one that kept her trembling hands occupied and her mind firmly tethered to the present. If she allowed herself to look up, to glance at the massive 4-poster bed draped in furs, or the hearth where they had spent countless nights tangled together in the firelight, she knew her resolve would shatter. Genevieve was not a Luna. The High Council of Elders, led by the perpetually scowling Elder Frederick, made sure she never forgot it. She was born of a lowly beta lineage from the outer fringes of the territory, an orphan of the border skirmishes. She had no dowry of fertile lands, no vast army of pure-blood warriors to pledge to the crown. What she had was a fierce, unwavering loyalty, a tactical mind that had saved Tristan's life during the grueling Blood Moon uprisings, and a soul that resonated so perfectly with his that the pack had silently accepted her presence. She was his mate in everything but blood and the ancient, binding bite. But love, as Elder Frederick had coldly pointed out in the Great Hall 3 weeks ago, could not feed a starving kingdom. Ethelgard was reeling from a devastating blight that had wiped out their winter harvests. The neighboring Silvermane pack, ruled by the wealthy and ruthlessly pragmatic Lord Harrison, held the grain reserves that could save Tristan's people. Harrison's price for the alliance was steep, yet simple. His daughter, Cecilia, was to sit on the throne of Ethelgard. She was to be marked, mated, and crowned as the legitimate Luna. Tristan had fought the decree. He had raged, his alpha aura suffocating the council chambers, shattering oak tables, and bringing seasoned warriors to their knees. He had sworn to find another way, to march on the Silvermane borders and take the grain by force. But it was Genevieve who had stopped him. She had stood before him, placing her hands on his chest, feeling the frantic, furious beating of his heart, and told him the truth he was too blind with love to see. A war would leave his people dead, and a dead kingdom needed no king. "You must marry her, Tristan," Genevieve had whispered, her voice steady even as her world collapsed. "You are the Alpha King. Your people come before your heart. They come before me." It had taken days of agonizing silence and suffocating grief, but eventually Tristan had yielded to the crown's heavy burden. The treaty was signed. The wedding date was set for the eve of the Hunter's Moon. Now, with the ceremony only 2 days away, Genevieve was packing the last of her life into a battered leather trunk. She took nothing of value, no jewels, no silk gowns bought from traveling merchants, not even the silver-hilted dagger Tristan had gifted her on their first anniversary. She packed only what she had brought to the castle: rough-spun dresses, worn leather boots, and a single faded woolen blanket. The heavy oak door creaked open, breaking the oppressive silence of the room. Agnes, the elderly head of the castle staff, slipped inside. The older woman's face, usually set in lines of stern authority, was crumpled in sorrow. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she held a tray with a steaming cup of chamomile tea, though her hands shook so badly it threatened to spill. "You should be resting, my lady," Agnes said, her voice thick with unshed tears. She set the tray down on a small side table and looked at the half-full trunk. "It isn't right. The goddess knows it isn't right. You are the true heart of this pack." "Agnes, please," Genevieve murmured, not looking up as she carefully placed a pair of thick socks into the corner of the trunk. "Do not make this harder than it already is. I am not a lady. I am just Genevieve." "You are the Luna," Agnes hissed, uncharacteristic anger flaring in her tone. "That pampered Silvermane princess knows nothing of our ways. She knows nothing of how you stayed awake for 3 days, nursing the orphans of the lower village through the winter fever. She knows nothing of how you calmed the king's wolf when he returned from the slaughter at the ridge. She is a political transaction. You are his soul." Genevieve closed her eyes, a single hot tear escaping to track down her pale cheek. She quickly wiped it away, her expression hardening. "A soul cannot shield our borders from rogue attacks, Agnes. A soul cannot bake bread to feed the starving pups in the lower rings. My departure buys Ethelgard peace and prosperity. It is a trade I am willing to make." Agnes stepped forward, wrapping her warm, weathered arms around Genevieve's trembling frame. The young woman finally stopped moving, leaning into the embrace, allowing herself a brief moment of profound weakness. She breathed in the familiar scent of lavender and lye soap that clung to the older woman, committing it to memory. "Where will you go?" Agnes whispered into her hair. "The king has forbidden you from leaving the territory completely. He wants you set up in the Eastern Manor, well guarded and provided for." "I cannot stay in Ethelgard," Genevieve replied, pulling back and looking into Agnes's eyes with quiet determination. "To remain here, close to him, while another woman carries his mark and his pups, it would turn me bitter. It would poison the love I have for him, and I refuse to let that happen. I have secured passage with a merchant caravan heading deep into the neutral human territories by the coast. I will leave before the sun rises, immediately after the ceremony concludes." Agnes gasped. "The human territories? Genevieve, you will have no pack. A wolf without a pack. A wolf without a pack survives by relying on herself," Genevieve interrupted gently. She closed the lid of the leather trunk, the heavy brass clasps snapping shut with a sound of chilling finality. "My presence here will only serve as a ghost haunting their marriage. Cecilia will never feel secure on her throne as long as I am within breathing distance of her mate. For Tristan's reign to be stable, I must become a memory." She turned toward the window, looking out over the sprawling courtyard. Men were already erecting the wooden scaffolding for the grand stands. Torches flickered in the biting wind, illuminating the ancient moonstone altar at the center of the square. Tomorrow, the Silvermane procession would arrive. Tomorrow, the usurper would walk through those gates. Genevieve rested her forehead against the cold glass. She had made her peace with the shadows, but she did not know if she had the strength to watch the light officially pass to someone else. The arrival of the Silvermane contingent was nothing short of a theatrical spectacle designed to humiliate and awe. As the midday sun struggled to pierce through the heavy, iron-grey clouds, the massive ironwood gates of Ethelgard were thrown open. Horns blared from the battlements, a sharp, triumphant sound that made Genevieve's inner wolf recoil and bare her teeth in distress. From her vantage point on the upper cloister balcony, hidden in the deep shadows of a stone gargoyle, Genevieve watched the procession pour into the courtyard. Lord Harrison rode at the front, mounted on a massive black destrier, his armor gleaming with excessive silver ornamentation. Behind him marched 100 heavily armed Silvermane warriors, their cloaks dyed a rich, arrogant crimson. But it was the carriage in the center that drew every eye. Crafted from polished mahogany and gilded with gold leaf, it looked entirely out of place against the rugged, battle-scarred stones of Ethelgard. As the carriage rolled to a halt before the main keep, the door was opened by a servant, and Cecilia stepped out. Even Genevieve, from 100 feet above, could not deny the woman's striking beauty. Cecilia was tall, her posture radiating an aristocratic entitlement that had been bred into her for generations. Her hair was a cascade of pale spun gold, styled intricately with silver pins, and she wore a gown of deep sapphire velvet lined with white ermine. She did not look like a warrior. She looked like a queen stepping down among peasants. Tristan stood at the base of the steps, waiting to receive his bride. He wore his formal alpha leathers, dark and imposing, a cloak of thick wolf pelt draped over his broad shoulders. Genevieve studied his face, her heart aching. He looked magnificent, yet entirely hollow. There was a rigid tension in his jaw, and dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes. He had not slept. He had not sought her out in 2 days, adhering strictly to the ancient laws that forbade the groom from seeing his previous lovers before the mating rites. It was a cowardly tradition, Genevieve thought bitterly, designed to make the transition of power easier for the men, leaving the discarded women to suffer in silence. Cassian, Tristan's fiercely loyal beta, stood a half step behind the king. Cassian's face was a mask of thunderous disapproval. As Cecilia approached, offering her delicate gloved hand to Tristan, Cassian actively looked away, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. "Welcome to Ethelgard, Lady Cecilia," Tristan's voice carried across the courtyard, deep and formal, stripped of all the warmth Genevieve knew it possessed. He took her hand, bowing his head slightly, but he did not press his lips to her knuckles. "Alpha King," Cecilia replied, her voice melodic but carrying a sharp, crystalline edge. She looked around the grim courtyard, her delicate nose wrinkling slightly as if the very air offended her. "It is a formidable fortress, though I must admit it lacks refinement. My father and I have brought master architects from our territory. We shall have the eastern wing completely rebuilt by spring." A low rumble vibrated through the courtyard. It was Cassian, unable to suppress a growl at the sheer audacity of an unmarked outsider planning to demolish their ancestral home within seconds of arriving. Tristan shot his beta a warning glare, instantly silencing him. We will discuss renovations after the winter has passed and the people are fed, Tristan said stiffly. He turned to lead her inside. Come, the journey has been long. Chambers have been prepared for you. As they disappeared into the keep, Genevieve felt a cold numbness wash over her. She turned away from the balcony, retreating into the dim corridors of the castle. She needed to stay out of sight, to blend into the stonework until the morrow. But fate, it seemed, was not entirely done torturing her. As she rounded a corner near the royal library, she nearly collided with the very person she was desperately trying to avoid. "Watch your steps, servant," a sharp voice snapped. Genevieve froze. Standing before her, flanked by two of her crimson-cloaked guards, was Cecilia. The Silvermane heir looked Genevieve up and down, her pale blue eyes narrowing as she took in Genevieve's plain brown dress, devoid of any house sigils or jewels. Yet, despite her humble attire, Genevieve did not lower her eyes. She stood tall, her spine straight, her own golden brown eyes meeting the icy blue of the intruder. Cecilia's gaze lingered on Genevieve's face, and a flicker of recognition crossed her features. The rumors of the king's beloved unmarked mate were known across the continent. Cecilia tilted her head, a cruel, knowing smile playing on her painted lips. "Ah," Cecilia purred, stepping closer. The heavy, suffocating scent of jasmine and expensive rosewater rolled off her, masking the natural scent of her wolf completely. "You are the stray, the one he kept in his bed while waiting for a real queen to arrive." Genevieve felt her wolf snarl in her chest, a primal urge to tear the throat from the woman standing before her. But she forced the beast down, locking it behind an iron cage of discipline. "I am Genevieve," she replied, her voice even, completely devoid of emotion. "I hope you find your accommodations satisfactory, my lady." Cecilia laughed, a high, tinkling sound, devoid of genuine amusement. "They are adequate, though they reek of old history. Tell me, Genevieve, will you be attending the ceremony tomorrow night? I understand it is customary for the displaced to witness the ascension of their betters. A humbling experience, I imagine, but necessary for the pack's closure." "I will be present," Genevieve lied smoothly, her expression a mask of stone, "to see the treaty fulfilled and the kingdom secured." "Good," Cecilia sneered softly, stepping into Genevieve's personal space. "Make sure you stand where he can see you. I want him to look at what he is throwing away right as my fangs pierce his flesh. I want him to remember exactly who owns him now." With a swish of her heavy velvet skirts, Cecilia pushed past Genevieve, her guards following closely behind. Genevieve stood perfectly still in the empty corridor, her hands balled into tight fists at her sides, her nails dug into her palms so deeply that crescent-shaped drops of blood welled up, dripping slowly onto the cold stone floor. She closed her eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "One more day," she told herself. "Just one more day, and I will be gone." That evening, the castle was a hive of frantic activity. Feasts were being prepared. The great hall was being draped in the banners of Ethelgard and Silvermane, and the nervous energy of the pack vibrated in the air. Genevieve stayed confined to a small servants' quarter on the lowest level, having surrendered her chambers hours ago. Late into the night, as the castle finally settled into a restless quiet, a soft, urgent knock came at her door. She opened it to find Cassian standing in the dim light of a hallway torch. The formidable Beta looked exhausted, his broad shoulders slumped. "Cassian," she breathed softly, pulling him into the tiny room and shutting the door. "He's losing his mind, Jen," Cassian rasped, running a massive hand through his dark hair. "He's been pacing his study for 6 hours. He won't speak. He nearly snapped the neck of a Silvermane guard who accidentally spilled wine on his boots at dinner. His wolf is surfacing, and it's violent. He knows you're leaving." "He knew I was leaving the moment he signed the treaty," Genevieve said firmly, though her heart pounded frantically against her ribs. "No, he thought he could stash you in the Eastern Manor, keep you as a mistress. When Agnes told him you booked passage on a human caravan..." Cassian swallowed hard. "He lost it. He tried to come down here. I had to physically restrain him, Jen. I had to remind him that if he breaks the treaty now, Harrison's men will slaughter us before dawn." Genevieve felt a terrifying mix of elation and horror. Tristan still wanted her. His wolf was fighting for her, but the reality of their situation remained unchanged. "You did the right thing, Cassian," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She reached out, grasping his rough hands. "You are the Beta. You must protect him from himself. Tomorrow, when the sun sets, he must take her mark. You have to ensure he goes through with it. Promise me." Cassian looked down at her, his eyes shining with unshed grief. "You are the strongest wolf I know, Genevieve. Stronger than me, stronger than the king." He squeezed her hands tightly. "I promise." The eve of the hunter's moon arrived with a bitter, biting frost. The courtyard of Aethelgard was packed shoulder to shoulder with thousands of werewolves. The ambient heat from their bodies warred against the freezing air, sending plumes of breath spiraling upward into the starry night sky. The sheer volume of the gathered pack was staggering. Every able-bodied wolf from the surrounding villages had come to witness the salvation of their kingdom. At the very center of the courtyard, elevated on a dais of black ironwood, sat the Moonstone altar. It was an ancient relic, a massive slab of shimmering, opalescent stone that had absorbed the blood and vows of alphas for 1,000 years. 4 enormous bonfires blazed at the corners of the dais, casting dancing, erratic shadows over the solemn faces of the crowd. Genevieve stood at the very back of the courtyard, hidden beneath the deep overhang of the western battlements. She was swathed in a heavy, dark traveling cloak, the hood pulled low over her face. Her leather trunk was already loaded onto the merchant carriage, waiting outside the postern gate. She only needed to witness the binding, to see the magic seal the treaty, before she slipped away into the night forever. A sudden, deafening beat of heavy war drums silenced the murmuring crowd. The ceremony was beginning. From the keep doors emerged High Priest Bartholomew. He was a frail, ancient wolf, draped in robes of stark white, carrying a silver chalice and a ritual dagger forged from bone. He ascended the dais slowly, raising his hands to the moon. Following him were the betrothed. A collective gasp swept through the crowd as Cecilia stepped into the firelight. She was draped in a diaphanous gown of silver thread that seemed to catch and amplify the moonlight. A crown of twisted silver thorns and white diamonds rested on her blonde hair. She looked ethereal, a terrifying goddess of winter come to claim her throne. She walked with supreme confidence, her eyes fixed entirely on the prize at the end of the aisle. Beside her, Tristan walked with the slow, measured steps of a man marching to the gallows. Genevieve's breath hitched in her throat. Tristan was bare-chested, per the ancient custom, displaying the heavy muscles and scarred skin of a warrior king. He wore dark leather trousers and an intricate ceremonial harness of silver chain draped over his chest, but it was his face that tore at Genevieve's soul. His jaw was locked so tightly it looked carved from granite. His eyes, usually a warm, vibrant amber, were dark, vacant, and utterly dead. He was suffocating his inner wolf, burying his true nature beneath the mountain of duty. They reached the altar. High Priest Bartholomew began the chanting, his raspy voice echoing off the stone walls, speaking the ancient Lycan dialect that commanded the spirits of the earth and the moon to bear witness. Two bloodlines, divided by earth, bound by the moon. Two souls, sundered by fate, forged into one. Genevieve leaned against the cold stone pillar, her legs trembling. She clutched the fabric of her cloak over her chest, trying to physically hold her breaking heart together. She watched as Bartholomew handed the bone dagger to Cecilia. "Do you, Cecilia of the Silvermane, offer your blood, your wolf, and your loyalty to Ethelgard?" the high priest bellowed. "I do," Cecilia answered, her voice ringing out clear and triumphant. She took the blade and sliced a shallow, clean line across her palm, letting her blood drip into the silver chalice. Bartholomew took the dagger, wiping it clean with a white cloth, and handed it to Tristan. The silence in the courtyard was absolute. Thousands of wolves held their breath. Genevieve gripped the stone pillar, her knuckles turning white. "Do it," she prayed silently. "Just do it, Tristan. Save them." Tristan took the dagger. He stared down at the blade, the firelight glinting off the bone. His hand, usually so steady in battle, trembled violently. A low, barely audible growl rumbled deep within his chest, a sound of profound, feral agony. "Do you, Tristan of Ethelgard?" Bartholomew continued, his brow furrowing in concern at the king's hesitation. "Accept this blood? Do you offer your neck to receive her mark, to bind her as your Luna until the goddess calls you home?" Tristan slowly raised his head. He didn't look at Bartholomew. He didn't look at Cecilia, who was staring at him with a mixture of confusion and dawning anger. He turned his head, his golden eyes sweeping over the massive crowd. Genevieve froze. She knew he couldn't see her. She was completely hidden in the darkness, 100 yards away, masked by the scent of thousands of other wolves. But as his gaze swept past the western battlements, he stopped. Suddenly, the wind shifted. A sharp, icy gust swept down from the mountains, blowing directly from the battlements toward the altar. It carried the scent of pine, burning torches, damp earth, and something else. A scent that was suddenly, inexplicably overwhelming. Genevieve felt a strange, terrifying warmth bloom in her lower abdomen, radiating outward, flushing her skin and making her blood sing. It was a sensation she had never felt before, ancient and powerful. Unbeknownst to her, her dormant biology, triggered by the intense emotional trauma and the ambient magic of the Hunter's Moon ritual, had violently awakened. The scent of a true, destined mate, suppressed for years by her own insecurities and lower status, erupted from her in a wave so potent it made the wolves standing 10 feet away from her stumble and gasp. On the dais, Tristan's head snapped toward her exact location. The vacant, dead look in his eyes vanished, instantly replaced by a blazing, terrifying inferno of liquid gold. His alpha aura, previously suppressed, exploded outward with the force of a physical shockwave. Torches flickered wildly. Several near the altar were snuffed out completely. Mate. The word wasn't spoken. It was a psychic roar that reverberated through the very stones of the castle. Tristan, Cecilia hissed, stepping forward and reaching for his arm. What are you doing? Complete the vow. Tristan dropped the bone dagger. It clattered against the opalescent stone, a loud, sharp noise that shattered the silence. He turned his imposing frame toward Cecilia, his fangs elongating, fully dropping past his lower lip. A monstrous chest-rattling snarl ripped from his throat, echoing off the high walls of Ethelgard. Cecilia shrank back, genuine terror finally cracking her arrogant facade. Even Lord Harrison, standing in the front row, took a step backward, his hand instinctively dropping to the hilt of his sword. The ritual is broken, Tristan roared, his voice distorted, laced with the guttural dominance of his wolf. He did not look at the high priest. He did not look at the furious Silvermane Lord. His burning golden eyes remained locked on the shadowed corner of the western battlements. He pointed a massive, clawed finger directly at the darkness where Genevieve stood, paralyzed. There, the Alpha King commanded, his voice shaking the very foundations of the courtyard. There stands my Luna, the only woman who will ever bear my mark. For a fraction of a second, the courtyard of Ethelgard was entombed in absolute suffocating silence. It was the terrifying stillness that precedes an avalanche, a moment suspended in time before the world fractures. Then the realization of what Alpha King Tristan had just done crashed over the thousands of gathered wolves, and chaos erupted. Treason! Lord Harrison roared, the sound tearing from his throat as he lunged forward, his hand drawing a magnificent, ruby-hilted broadsword from its scabbard. The steel sang a deadly note in the freezing air. You dare humiliate the house of Silvermane? You dare break a sacred blood pact before the goddess? Instantly, the 100 crimson-cloaked Silvermane warriors drew their weapons. The metallic shing of blades being unsheathed echoed like a chorus of death. But before they could advance a single step toward the dais, Cassian moved. The beta did not draw a sword. Instead, he let his own monstrous wolf claw its way to the surface. With a deafening roar, Cassian shifted mid-stride, his bones snapping and reforming in the blink of an eye until a massive, midnight black timber wolf stood between the Silvermane forces and the altar, baring teeth the size of daggers. All around the courtyard, Ethelgard warriors followed their beta's lead. The terrifying sounds of shifting bone and ripping fabric filled the night as hundreds of defenders transformed, their low, rumbling growls shaking the very cobblestones beneath their paws. They were starving, they were exhausted, but they would die before they let an outsider draw blood from their king. Tristan ignored the impending slaughter. He ignored the furious screams of Cecilia, who had thrown the bone dagger at his feet and was now sobbing in a mixture of rage and profound humiliation. He had eyes only for the shadows of the western battlements. He vaulted off the 10-foot-high ironwood dais, landing with a heavy thud that cracked the paving stones. The massive crowd of Ethelgard citizens, terrified by the sudden surge of lethal alpha energy scrambled desperately to part for him. A wide path cleared instantly, leaving a direct line of sight between the king and the woman hidden in the dark cloak. Genevieve's mind screamed at her to run. The merchant carriage was waiting. Freedom, cold, lonely, but safe, was just beyond the postern gate. She commanded her legs to move, to turn and flee into the night. But her body betrayed her. The newly awakened scent rolling off her, a heady mixture of night-blooming jasmine and rain-soaked earth, had locked onto Tristan's aura. Her inner wolf was howling in joyous triumph, pinning her feet to the ground, refusing to abandon her true mate now that the bond had finally physically snapped into place. Tristan stalked toward her, his chest heaving, his golden eyes glowing with a terrifying, predatory possessiveness. As he breached the shadows of the overhang, he reached out, his massive hands gripping the edges of her heavy traveling cloak. With one swift motion, he ripped the garment away, letting it fall to the dirt. Genevieve stood exposed, trembling in her plain, rough-spun brown dress. She looked up into the face of the man she had loved in secret, the man she had tried to give away. "Tristan," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You fool. What have you done?" "What I should have done 5 years ago," he rasped, his voice a gravelly, inhuman purr. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply. The sound he made was a desperate, starved groan. "You lied to me, Jen. You told me we were just compatible. You told me my wolf would accept another." "I didn't know," she sobbed, her hands instinctively coming up to grip his broad, bare shoulders. "I swear to you, I didn't know." The scent, it only just woke. "Because the goddess refused to let you walk away from me," Tristan growled, pulling back just enough to frame her face with his calloused hands. "You are mine. You have always been my Luna. And you have just condemned your people to death." The furious voice of Lord Harrison broke the intimacy of the moment. The Silvermane Lord had shoved his way through the perimeter of growling Ethelgard wolves, heavily guarded by his own elite guard. His face was purple with rage. "This is your grand deception?" Harrison spat, gesturing toward Genevieve with his sword. "You spurn my daughter, an aristocratic pureblood, for a nameless border tramp. You have lost your mind, Tristan, and you have lost your kingdom. The treaty is void." Tristan slowly turned, pulling Genevieve behind his protective bulk. The romantic desperation in his eyes vanished, replaced by the chilling, calculating glare of a warlord. "The treaty was a farce, Harrison," Tristan said, his voice carrying clearly over the tense silence of the courtyard. "Do you think my spies are entirely blind? We intercepted the Raven bound for the coastal territories 3 nights ago." Harrison's face paled dramatically. The tip of his broadsword dipped a fraction of an inch. "I know about your dealings with the Barringer Syndicate," Tristan continued, his voice dripping with lethal disdain, mentioning the infamous, ruthless human merchant conglomerate that controlled the southern shipping lanes. "The blight that hit our winter harvests wasn't an act of nature. It was an act of sabotage. Your men poisoned the reservoirs in the upper valley using Barringer alchemical runoff. You manufactured a famine to force me into a corner, to put your daughter on my throne and gain control of the northern passes." A shocked gasp rippled through the Ethelgard citizens. The murmur of the crowd quickly escalated into a furious, collective snarl. The Beringer Syndicate was universally despised, known for bleeding territories dry and enslaving vulnerable populations through insurmountable debt. "Lies!" Harrison shouted, though his eyes darted nervously toward the exit. A desperate fabrication by a mad king to justify his broken vows. "We have the Beringer ledger, Harrison." Genevieve stepped out from behind Tristan, her voice cutting through the clamor like a silver blade. She was no longer trembling. The realization of the political game at play washed over her, sharpening her tactical mind. "I secured it myself through a contact in the lower rings. It details the exact weight of gold you paid to poison our soil." Cecilia, who had finally descended from the dais, stared at her father in horror. "Father, is this true? You told me they were simply cursed by the goddess." "Silence, Cecilia," Harrison barked. He looked around, realizing he was entirely surrounded by thousands of wolves who now knew he was the architect of their starvation. He raised his sword high. "Silvermane, to the gates, we march." Tristan raised a single hand, signaling his warriors. "Let them pass." Cassian shifted back to his human form, naked and furious, grabbing a cloak from a nearby guard. "My king, we cannot let them leave. They will return with their full army." "Let them go, Cassian," Tristan commanded coldly. "I will not have the blood of guests spilled in my courtyard, even if they are traitors. But hear me well, Harrison." Tristan's voice boomed, imbued with the full, terrifying weight of his alpha command. "If a single Silvermane boot crosses the river boundary into Ethelgard territory again, I will not stop at defending my borders. I will march on your keep, and I will burn it to the bedrock." Harrison did not reply. He shoved his weeping daughter toward her gilded carriage and ordered a rapid retreat. The Ethelgard pack parted, forming a tight, aggressive gauntlet of bared teeth and glowing eyes as the Silvermane procession fled the fortress in disgrace. When the heavy ironwood gates finally slammed shut behind the last crimson cloak, the courtyard fell into an exhausted, heavy silence. The impending war was no longer a threat. It was a certainty. Tristan turned back to Genevieve. The adrenaline of the confrontation began to fade, leaving behind the stark reality of their situation. They were facing starvation, a brutal winter, and an incoming siege from a wealthy enemy backed by the Beringer Syndicate. Yet, as Tristan looked at the woman standing before him, her chin held high despite the ragged clothes she wore, he felt no fear. He dropped to one knee on the cold stone, taking her scarred, unadorned hand in his. "My Luna," he said softly, the words ringing clearly in the quiet night. Thousands of Ethelgard wolves, from the fiercest warriors to the frailest elders, followed their king. In a breathtaking wave of submission and loyalty, the entire courtyard sank to their knees, bowing their heads to the unmarked orphan who had just saved them from a poisoned crown. The days following the shattered ceremony were a frantic, grueling blur of preparation. The air in Ethelgard changed. The oppressive weight of the forced marriage was gone, replaced by the sharp, metallic tension of impending war. The forge fires burned day and night, the rhythmic pounding of hammers on steel echoing through the valley. Genevieve found herself thrust into a reality she had never dared to dream of, yet felt entirely unprepared for. She was no longer confined to the shadows or the servant quarters. Tristan had moved her belongings into the grand royal suite, and the pack treated her with a newfound, almost terrifying reverence. When she walked the battlements to inspect the archer lines, seasoned veterans bowed their heads. When she visited the lower rings to check on the rationing, mothers held up their pups for her to bless. It terrified her. Late one evening, 5 days after the Silvermane retreat, Genevieve stood in the war room, staring down at a massive parchment map of the territory spread across the oak table. The room was lit by dozens of thick beeswax candles, casting long, flickering shadows over the miniature wooden wolf figurines that represented their troop deployments. The door creaked open and Tristan walked in. He looked exhausted. The dark circles under his eyes had returned, and his jaw was covered in a rough, dark stubble. He moved behind her, wrapping his massive arms around her waist and burying his face in her neck, inhaling deeply. Her newly awakened scent, the jasmine and earth, seemed to be the only thing that grounded him. "You should be sleeping," Tristan murmured against her skin, his voice rumbling pleasantly through her back. "Sleep is a luxury we cannot afford right now," Genevieve replied, leaning back into his embrace for a fleeting moment before tapping a wooden figurine on the map. "Harrison has blockaded the southern river pass. His troops are digging in. He isn't going to launch a frontal assault. He's going to wait for the snows to trap us, and then he's going to let the starvation do his work for him." Tristan sighed, releasing her and stepping up to the side of the table. He leaned heavily on his hands, staring at the map. "We have enough grain to last a month on quarter rations. If the winter is harsh, we won't make it to the spring thaw." Genevieve looked at him, her heart aching. "Tristan, why did you do it? Why did you throw the dagger down? You knew about the Barringer Syndicate's involvement before the ceremony. You could have gone through with the marking, secured the grain from the inside, and then dealt with Harrison quietly later." Tristan looked up, his golden eyes locking onto hers. The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Because of you, Genevieve. Because the moment the wind shifted and I smelled your true scent, I realized that surviving wasn't enough. What good is a kingdom if its king is dead inside? If I had marked her, the bond would have suffocated my wolf. I would have withered away on the throne, and Aethelgard would have been left with a tyrant Luna." He walked around the table, taking her hands in his. "The goddess awakened your scent at that exact moment for a reason. She was screaming at me to wake up. We will fight, Jen. We will bleed if we must. But we will do it together, as true mates." Genevieve felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away fiercely. Now was not the time for sentimentality. It was time for strategy. "Then we need an ally," Genevieve said, her voice turning crisp and businesslike. She pulled her hands away and moved to a heavy wooden chest in the corner of the room. She unlocked it with a small iron key hanging from her neck and withdrew a thick stack of letters bound in leather cord. Tristan frowned, watching her. "There are no allies left, Jen. The eastern packs are neutral, and the western territories are too far away to march an army through the snow." "You remember the Blood Moon uprisings?" Genevieve asked, dropping the letters onto the map. "When you were fighting the rogue factions in the south, I was left here to manage the supply lines." "I remember," Tristan said slowly. "You kept our army fed when the quartermasters said it was impossible." "I didn't do it alone," Genevieve confessed. "Untying the leather cord, I traded favors. I promised safe passage through our mountain tunnels to the Baringer Syndicate's biggest rival in the human realms, the Valerius Trading Company. And in exchange, I built a relationship with the Lord of the Skylar Valley. Tristan's eyes widened in genuine shock. Lord Skylar, the human warlord in the north. Genevieve, his forces are massive, but they despise wolves. They have hunted our kind for sport for centuries. They despise the Silvermane pack because Harrison's father slaughtered Skylar's grandfather. Genevieve corrected him, spreading the letters out. They bore the intricate wax seal of a silver stag. I have been writing to Lord Skylar in secret for 3 years, not as your mate, but as the shadow beta of Ethelgard. I have fed him intelligence on Silvermane troop movements. I have helped him secure his own borders. She picked up the most recent letter, the parchment, heavy and expensive. I sent a raven to him the night Harrison arrived with Cecilia. I told him that Harrison was aligning with the Baringer Syndicate to monopolize the grain, which would eventually crush Skylar's human markets. I offered him an alliance. Tristan stared at the woman before him, as if seeing her for the first time. He had always known she was intelligent, a brilliant, tactical mind who had saved his life on the battlefield. But he had not realized the sheer scope of her political maneuvering. While she was quietly packing her bags, preparing to walk away into obscurity to save his crown, she had simultaneously been laying the groundwork for a master stroke that could save the entire continent. And his response? Tristan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He marches, Genevieve said, a fierce, triumphant light burning in her golden brown eyes. He is bringing 10,000 heavy cavalry and 500 wagons of winter wheat. They will flank Harrison from the north in exactly 6 days. Tristan let out a breathless laugh, a sound of pure disbelief and awe. He stepped forward, grabbing her face and kissing her with a bruising, desperate passion. It was a kiss that tasted of impending war, of survival, and of absolute, unwavering reverence. You, Tristan breathed against her lips, his wolf purring so loudly the sound vibrated in the room, are the most dangerous creature in this fortress. I am a beta orphan, Genevieve replied softly, though a wicked smile played on her lips. I had to learn how to survive in a world of pure bloods. No, Tristan corrected her, dropping to one knee before her, right there in the war room, surrounded by maps and candlelight. He looked up at her, his eyes blazing with the fierce, unyielding devotion of an alpha claiming his soul. You are Genevieve of Ethelgard, the shadow that saved the king, and it is time I made it official before the war begins. He didn't ask this time. He didn't wait for a high priest or a grand ceremony. He simply leaned forward, burying his face into the curve of her neck. Genevieve gasped, her hands tangling in his dark hair as she felt the sharp prick of his fangs against her skin. Then he bit down. The pain was a blinding flash of white light, followed instantly by a surge of pure, euphoric magic. It felt as though a tether of molten gold had been physically hammered into her soul, connecting her heart, her mind, and her wolf directly to his. She could feel his immense strength, his fears, his profound love, all rushing into her mind like a breaking dam. When Tristan pulled back, a perfect, crescent-shaped mark, glowing faintly with a silver light, rested over her pulse point. The bond was sealed. She was no longer the unmarked burden. She was the Luna of Ethelgard, and heaven helped the Silvermane army when they came to claim her home. The true brutality of winter descended upon Ethelgard 3 days before the Silvermane army arrived. The skies turned a bruised, permanent violet, and the snow fell in thick, blinding sheets that buried the lower villages and froze the surrounding rivers solid. When Lord Harrison's forces finally crested the southern ridge, they did not look like a traditional pack coming to wage an honorable war. They looked like a mechanized harbinger of death. Harrison had brought 4,000 crimson-cloaked warriors, but more terrifyingly, he had brought the Baringa Syndicate's siege engines, massive iron catapults and ballistas wrought from blackened steel and dragged by teams of enslaved draft horses were positioned just out of range of Ethelgard's longbowmen. Standing on the highest battlement, wrapped tightly in a thick mantle of snow-bear fur, Genevieve watched the enemy encampment grow. The glowing silver crescent on her neck pulsed with a steady, comforting heat, a physical manifestation of Tristan's strength flowing into her veins. Tristan stood beside her, his jaw set in a rigid line, his golden eyes tracking the movement of the heavy artillery. "They aren't going to starve us out," Tristan observed grimly, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "Harrison knows he doesn't have the supplies to maintain a siege camp through a blizzard. He is going to try and break the walls." "Wolves do not use siege engines," Cassian snarled from Tristan's left, pacing the stone walkway. "It is cowardice. A true alpha settles disputes with fang and claw." "Harrison is no longer a true alpha. He is a businessman," Genevieve replied, her voice cold and analytical. She leaned over the parapet. "Those catapults aren't loaded with stone. I recognize the iron barrels stacked beside them. It's Baringa alchemical fire, a volatile mixture of naphtha, sulfur, and ground brimstone. It burns hot enough to melt stone, and water only spreads it." Tristan looked at her, alarmed. "How do you fight it?" "We don't," Genevieve said flatly. "We survive it. I read of a similar tactic used in the Eastern Human Wars, documented in the private journals of Sir William Marshall, a tactician who survived a naphtha siege by abandoning the outer walls entirely. If the fire hits the wooden hoardings of our outer defenses, the defenders will be cooked alive in their armor." She turned to Cassian, her tone shifting into the absolute authority of a Luna. "Evacuate the outer ring. Pull all the archers and infantry back to the inner keep and the stone cloisters. Cover the wooden roofs of the inner bailey with wet hides and pack them with snow." Cassian hesitated for a fraction of a second, instinctively looking to his king for confirmation. "Do exactly as the Luna commands," Tristan growled, his aura flaring to back her words. "Move, Cassian." They had barely finished evacuating the outer walls when the first volley launched. The sky above Ethelgard shrieked as dozens of iron barrels hurtled through the air, trailing thick, noxious black smoke. They smashed into the outer battlements and the cobblestones of the lower courtyard. Upon impact, the barrels shattered, unleashing a torrent of liquid, sickly green fire. The heat was instantaneous and suffocating, even through the freezing blizzard. The wooden scaffolding, the guard towers, and the heavy oak gates erupted into blinding green infernos. The screams of the Silvermane commanders ordering the second volley echoed over the roar of the flames. Harrison was creating a breach. For 2 agonizing days, the bombardment continued. The outer defences of Ethelgard were reduced to a landscape of molten slag and charred timber. The air within the inner keep grew toxic, filled with the stench of sulphur and burning pine. The pack huddled in the subterranean crypts and the great hall, terrified by a weapon they could neither fight nor comprehend. But Genevieve did not hide. She moved constantly through the packed, frightened crowds. She knelt beside weeping mothers, her glowing mark a beacon of hope in the gloom. Whispering words of courage, she worked with the healers, using her knowledge of herbs to treat smoke inhalation. She was the calm center of the storm, and the pack's loyalty, once given out of respect for their king, deepened into absolute worship for their queen. On the dawn of the third day, the bombardment abruptly stopped. The eerie silence that followed was more terrifying than the explosions. "They're out of ammunition," Genevieve deduced, standing with Tristan in the war room, wiping a streak of soot from her forehead. "Or they've created a large enough breach to march their infantry through." A blood-chilling howl tore through the morning air, signaling the charge. "They are coming through the main gate," Cassian burst into the room, his armor scorched. "Harrison is leading the vanguard himself. He has 2,000 warriors in hybrid form." Tristan drew his broadsword, the ancient weapon of the Ethelgard kings. He turned to Genevieve, his eyes fierce. "Stay in the keep. Lock the iron doors. If you fall, I will burn the keep myself before I let them take it," Genevieve interrupted, grabbing a silver-tipped spear from the weapon rack. "But you will not fall. Lord Schuyler's cavalry is due today. We just have to hold the choke point at the inner gates." Tristan looked at her, his chest swelling with a devastating mixture of fear for her life and profound, consuming pride. He didn't argue. He knew better than to try and cage a wolf who had finally found her teeth. They rushed to the inner courtyard. The scene was apocalyptic. Through the smoking ruins of the outer walls, a sea of crimson-cloaked Silvermane warriors poured in. The fighting was instantly brutal, a chaotic melee of shifting bone, flashing steel, and feral roars. Tristan was a god of war let off his leash. He fought in his hybrid state, a terrifying amalgamation of man and wolf, his broadsword cleaving through Silvermane armor with terrifying ease. He held the center of the line, a mountain of muscle and fury, refusing to yield a single inch of stone. But sheer numbers began to tell. The Ethelgard defenders, weak from rationing and exhausted from the siege, were slowly being pushed back. Suddenly, the enemy ranks parted, and Lord Harrison stepped forward, flanked by 6 massive, fully shifted dire wolves. He looked pristine, his silver armor untouched by the soot and blood that covered the battlefield. "Yield, Tristan," Harrison bellowed, his voice amplified by the enclosed courtyard. "Look around you. Your walls are broken. Your people are dying. Surrender the crown. Hand over the beta trash you call a mate, and I will let the rest of your pack live as thralls." Tristan let out a roar of absolute, unadulterated hatred and lunged forward, ignoring the exhaustion burning in his muscles. He clashed with Harrison's elite guard, his sword sparking against their heavy armor. But there were too many. A massive grey dire wolf clamped its jaws onto Tristan's left arm, its fangs sinking deep into the flesh, pulling the Alpha King to his knees. "No!" Genevieve screamed. She vaulted over a fallen stone pillar, her spear gripped tightly in her hands. She didn't have the physical strength of a pure-blood warrior, but she had something deadlier, absolute, terrifying precision. She hurled the silver-tipped spear. It flew true, burying itself deep into the neck of the dire wolf holding Tristan. The beast whimpered, releasing the king and collapsing into the snow. Harrison sneered, stepping forward to raise his broadsword over the wounded Tristan. A brave little stray, but bravery cannot stop steel. Before Harrison could bring the blade down, a sound echoed through the valley. It was not the howl of a wolf. It was the deep, resonant, earth-shattering blast of a brass war horn. The war horn shattered the frozen air, halting every fighter in the courtyard. A second blast followed, deeper and more urgent, as thunder rolled beneath the ground. Lord Harrison's triumph dissolved into confusion as he turned toward the shattered gates. From the blinding snowstorm surged the cavalry of Schuyler Valley, 10,000 armored knights charging like a tide of iron, their lances lowered, banners of the silver stag snapping above them. They crashed into the exposed Silvermane army. The impact was devastating. Lines broke instantly, discipline collapsed, and panic spread as soldiers were thrown into chaos. Inside the courtyard, Harrison's victory unraveled. As he tried to flee, Genevieve struck first. Seizing a fallen axe, she shattered the portcullis locks, trapping him within. Tristan rose, wounded yet unyielding. His presence alone forced Harrison back. When the Silvermane Lord attacked, Tristan met him head-on, overpowering him with brutal strength. In a single decisive motion, he ended the fight. Silence fell. The enemy surrendered. Through the smoke and ruin, Tristan found Genevieve. She stood trembling but unbroken, the strategist, the protector, the heart of their survival. Days later, as winter light returned, Ethelgard endured, and beside its king stood not a shadow, but a queen forged in fire. Genevieve's journey from a discarded, unmarked beta to the mastermind queen who saved an entire kingdom proves that true power doesn't come from pure bloodlines or political wealth. It comes from intellect, loyalty, and a heart brave enough to fight for those you love. Tristan nearly sacrificed his soul for duty, but it was their undeniable, fated bond that shattered the ancient rules and rewrote history. What would you have done in Genevieve's place? Would you have walked away into the freezing rain to save the kingdom, or would you have fought for your alpha from the very beginning? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love this story of betrayal, fierce loyalty, and the ultimate werewolf romance drama, please like this video, share it with your friends who love a badass Luna, and subscribe to the channel for more epic, original fantasy stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a twist.